So at the end of last class, we were talking about thought experiments. So thought experiment is an imagined experiment. You kind of imagine a scenario and then answer questions about it. This definition, if you want to call that a definition, this definition will come up in a later slide as well, so don't stress out about getting it all down right this second. So the other thing that we talked about last class is how our reasoning is supposed to work when we're doing thought experiments or when we're making judgments about thought experiments. What's going on here? And then depending on what's going on when we're doing thought experiments, what do thought experiments do? What do they accomplish? Do they give us knowledge about the world? If so, how? So this class, we're going to review 3 views about thought experiments. They're the 3 views that were in the reading. We'll consider some reasons for and against each view during the in-class assignment, and we'll discuss implications of each view. So again, thought experiments. The idea here is it's an experiment that takes place in the mind. You imagine some scenario or multiple scenarios, and you answer questions about these scenarios. And our answers to these questions are supposed to tell us something that philosophers care about. What it is telling us is maybe what we're going to have to figure out. All we know now is that philosophers care about it. So, an example. This is one we did last class. You do something bad without the ability to do otherwise. Are you responsible for doing something bad? At first it seemed like, no, you can only be responsible for the things that you do when you have the ability to do something else. Then we considered this thought experiment, and some people's minds seemed to change. So the second example should say, can you prevent harm to a group of people by harming someone? And if you can, what does that tell us? So let's just kind of revisit these examples. A company installs devices in a classroom that can disrupt your thinking. These devices can disrupt your thinking so much that they will make you fail a test if they are on. However, the devices will only disrupt your thinking during tests when you're doing well on a test. If you're failing a test in this classroom, then the devices never activate. Don, get it, fails a test in this classroom. The device is never activated. So is Don responsible for failing the test? And we got a lot of yeses last class. So if he is responsible, then we don't seem to think that we are responsible only when we could have done something else, because Don could not have not failed the test. He would have failed on his own or failed because of the devices. So either way he fails, but for some reason, in this case, we want to hold him responsible. So that's supposed to tell us something about responsibility. Okay, so this other example, suppose you're a passenger in your friend's car. They're texting while driving. They fail to see that the next traffic light has turned red, so they're still driving at high speed. As you realize this, you also realize that they are veering toward the sidewalk and are about to hit a group of people that just finished crossing the street. There's not time to slow the car down, but you could easily reach the steering wheel to prevent the car from hitting the group. However, if you turn the car, it will hit one pedestrian remaining in the crosswalk. Whoever is hit, they will certainly be killed in a gruesome manner, should you turn the car away from the group toward the lone pedestrian. So prior to considering this case, we were asking the question, is it ever okay to cause harm? And, like we would expect, many people thought, no, you can't cause harm, you shouldn't do that. But then when we considered this case, some people thought, wow, I kind of feel like I should steer the car towards that lone pedestrian and harm them. Why? Because I want to prevent harm to the 5 people that would otherwise be harmed. If you think that, then it's not always wrong to cause harm. So, going back to this question about intuitions, is our judgment about this case evidence? Are we justified in whatever our response is to this case? Suppose everyone in the room agrees about what we should do in this case. Does that make it like a universal truth? Or is it like probably a universal truth? If we can get a lot of people to agree. Okay, so right now we're just asking questions. So in the reading, there were 3 views represented about how thought experiments work, what they're supposed to do. So the first view is Platonism. Platonism because it's supposed to reflect the ideas of Plato. Maybe you've heard of that person. But you could summarize Platonism about thought experiments like this. Look, our judgments about thought experiments reveal universal truths about the world, and they do this without any empirical evidence. What do I mean by empirical evidence? Anyone? Yeah.
Like things you can measure.
Yeah, things you can measure. So it's like what scientists, the kind of evidence scientists are looking for. As opposed to, say, whatever evidence we'd be considering when we're doing math or something, right? We don't run an experiment to figure out what 2 times 17 gives us. Whatever evidence there is for the answer to 2 times 17, it's not empirical. Okay, so the idea here is when we're doing thought experiments, somehow our judgments about thought experiments are revealing universal truths about the world, and the evidence for these universal truths and the evidence involved in our reasoning about these thought experiments is not of the empirical kind. It's more of the mathy kind, whatever type you want to call that. In philosophy, we usually call that a priori evidence, or a priori stuff, more generally. And you'll find out how to spell a priori when you do your in-class assignment. So that's that view. Next view is empiricism. The next 2 views are sort of hybrid views. So it's like empiricism plus this claim that thought experiments are arguments. So there's 2 parts to it. So the first part's pretty straightforward. Thought experiments are just arguments in disguise. And then the empiricism part is that second sentence. Experience is our evidence for or against the argument's premises. So the idea here is you give me a thought experiment, I'll reconstruct it as an argument for or against something. And then if you want to question any of these premises, I'll refer to my own experience or your own experience to give support for the premises. See some pens moving, so I'll give you guys a few more seconds before I move on to number 3. Okay, so 3 is also a form of empiricism, but the second claim is different. So instead of saying thought experiments arguments, we're going to say thought experiments are simulations that we run in our mind. So the empiricism bit, again, is that second sentence, and the idea is, look, our experience is what is informing whatever our judgments are about this simulation. So in both the latter two cases, the type of evidence being considered is different than the type of evidence we're considering in the first case, right? So Platonism is concerned with like not empirical evidence, but some other type. Empiricism is concerned with experience. That's the type of evidence we're interested in. So right, it's the type of things that scientists are measuring. It's the type of thing that you and I could like just see or hear or taste, etc., etc. Okay. So you guys have done the reading. You guys have looked at some of the reasons for and against each of these views. Who wants to try to argue against one of these or for one of these? Or you can argue for like multiple. If you don't have any, firm argument for or against anything, if you just have a thought, like just a reason, not a full-blown argument, but just a reason for or against a view, feel free to share. Zach.
I definitely don't think it's number 3, just because even though most simulations are in our head, we only think about them because they could happen in real life, which means that, like, I guess if you were thinking about it beforehand, it makes sense, but I just think, like, for most, like, things in my life, if I go back, I look on my past experience rather more so than something I have, like, just going on in my mind. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but.
Okay, yeah, so there's two thoughts there that we might want to get clear on. So one is the idea that when we are doing a thought experiment, whatever the concepts and ideas are in this thought experiment, we're like constructing them from our experience, right? So when I mentioned a car in that one example, you're in your friend's car, different images of cars came to all of your minds based on your past experience with cars, right? So like maybe some of you were imagining a station wagon and some of you were not, right? So these are differences in how our experience kind of constructed that simulation, if we're accepting this simulation view. But then our experience can also inform maybe whatever our answer to the question about that case was. So the question that we asked was something like, is it okay to cause the car to kill one person so that it doesn't kill 5? Whatever your experience and your history is, those experiences can be informing what answer you want to give to that question. Right? So experience informs the thought experiment process in 2 different ways. So then the question is, that Zach was bringing up is, so does that mean that the thought experiment is only in our mind? And it seems like no, if what we're saying is our experience can inform both the simulation itself and our judgments about the simulation. I agree with you, by the way, that it seems like our experience seems to inform the process. Go ahead.
I would say that's something against the Platonism, I pronounce it, is that like since they don't use any like empirical evidence, it's more of like an appeal to nature. So like whatever your brain thinks it is, so that's kind of like a fallacy.
Interesting. So I'm trying to not reveal what I think, even though I might agree with you, which just reveals what I think. Here's what I would say to that. A true Platonist or a ardent Platonist is going to say something like the following. No. These judgments you have are not about anything in the world, and they're not a result of anything in the world. You're like accessing something else besides the world. So wherever truth exists, that's what you're accessing. And so, yeah, if you're thinking about empirical stuff, I could see why you would think we need to consider nature here. So, like, when we're considering empirical stuff, we're talking about, like, things that we can look at and measure, and that's empirical stuff. But there are other truths that aren't things that we can see, right? We can't see that, certain mathematical truths are true. And so when we do these thought experiments, we're kind of accessing those types of truths, whatever the truths are in math, or maybe the truths in ethics or in politics. Things that you don't necessarily see, you just have a strong sense about. So the response to the thought you were sharing would be something like, nature is irrelevant, because these judgments that we're having about these cases aren't judgments that are the result of some natural process. They're judgments about something else, something non-natural. So it's not an appeal to nature, it's an appeal to something besides nature. What do you guys think of that response? Go ahead.
Wouldn't the appeal be to nature just because nature kind of influences your intuition in a sense?
Okay, so maybe you could push back by saying, no, look, we've run experiments. When I, put this magnet thing near your brain, your intuitions about certain types of cases change. So don't tell me that your intuitions are the result of some non-natural process. Like, I'm showing you right now, like, look, here's a brain, I tweak some part of that brain, and then the person whose brain it is, their judgment changes. So it's at least partly a natural thing. So whatever you're going to say about, accessing this non-empirical stuff, the empirical stuff and nature is a part of the story. It can't be entirely non-natural. So yeah, that's one way to push back on the Platonist. But notice that concedes something to the Platonist. It concedes the possibility that there is non-natural stuff occurring when we're doing thought experiments. It's not just natural. All we've been able to push back on is the idea that it's all non-natural. So that response that I just gave you only gives us the idea that some of it is natural. We haven't gotten all the way to empiricism yet. Other thoughts, arguments, reasons for or against these? So one thing that was mentioned in the reading is an argument against Platonism that you guys haven't mentioned yet, and it's something like this. So you're telling me that we have some sort of access to something that we have no empirical evidence for, and that our judgments about these things that we imagine are revealing something about that stuff that we have no empirical evidence for, these universal truths that you're talking about. That sounds a lot like magic. And I don't know any grown-ups who believe in magic. So why should I believe this story you're telling me about thought experiments? Past the age of 9 years old, why should I believe that? Does it seem like magical thinking to you all? I'm getting some nods. To a lot of philosophers, it doesn't for some reason.
It's just the brain working like it's supposed to.
You think that when we're doing thought experiments, it's just like, it's a psychological process?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I don't think there's any access to something non-natural, because if you get a baby, if a baby could speak, they wouldn't. I don't know if I could say with certainty that they would make the same decisions as our intuitions say.
Mhm.
So if you put a child born in an area with people with the same intuition, and then you move them to another area that with people that think differently, they would adapt to think that way. Adapt. You know what I mean?
Sure. So it sounds like if if I understand you, you're saying, look, a lot of what we believe, or a lot of our intuitions, including our judgments about these cases, are largely a function of where we grew up, like, or what culture we grew up in, or maybe like what our parents taught us. How do we know? Because take a baby that grows up in this culture and compare it to a baby that grows up in a different culture, and they have different beliefs. And there's actually quite a lot of studies from philosophers who've done this very thing. So they give them cases just like the ones that they give people the cases just like the ones we've considered in many other cases, and they sample people's judgments about them across cultures, and they find that across cultures there are differences in what people think about this. I mean, so that there's some evidence for what you're talking about. Now, in a sense, we shouldn't be at all surprised by that, right? Because like we couldn't even get everyone in this room to agree about both of the cases we considered, and we at least all live in like one relatively small area, right? So it wouldn't be surprising when you expand the sample to the whole world, like you would get more disagreement about these cases. It is interesting to think, though, what follows from the idea that there is like maybe widespread disagreement about any one of these cases. Especially if, according to the Platonist, we're supposed to be getting universal truths out of these cases. So one thing you might think is if we're getting universal truths out of these thought experiments, then our judgments about these cases would be universal, or at least near universal. Go ahead.
If it's a universal truth, would that be considered like something natural? Or is that intuition?
Okay, so something can be universally true in a natural sense or in a non-natural sense, right? So here's a universal truth, or something that we probably take to be universally true, that doesn't seem to be natural. 2 + 2 = 4. Seems like every time you have 2 and 2, you get 4 universally. But that's not an empirical thing. That's not like a natural. That's not a truth of the natural world, so to speak, that we have to make measurements and analyze data to get, right? But there might be truths that are universal that are natural as well, like the laws of nature, like whatever physicists are discovering. So like, Einstein's equation, E = mc². Maybe that's like a universal truth, and that is empirical. So something can be a universal truth and be either empirical or not, is the idea. So I'll just throw some of my cards out on the table. I started philosophy accepting a different one of these than I currently accept. So it doesn't matter which one I accept. The idea is I changed my mind. And I'd like to think that I changed my mind for good reasons. Like the more I studied philosophy and the more I learned and the better I got at it, the more I was convinced of the right answer or the right view. Who knows if that's actually the case? All I can say is, studying philosophy caused, and really studying psychology, caused me to change my answer or my view. So feel free to change your mind throughout the course about something, or, throughout the course of writing a paper. Totally allowed to change your mind.